Hi everyone. This video will show you a way of mixing your own chromatic black tone, creating value scales, and an intro to some monochromatic painting techniques. So let's go for it. I'm going to start using 3 different primary colors. I'm using cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and ultramarine blue. Along with your primary colors, you'll need a palette knife, a cup for water, and it helps to have a rag close by whenever you're painting. I begin by mixing equal parts of all 3 primaries, using my palette knife to scoop paint into a separate section or a separate pile on my palette. I then knead the colors together, pressing my knife into the glass palette. Having a flat palette is really important for this, so you can really mix those tones without losing too much of your acrylics, because you'll find that your acrylics will dry pretty darn fast. So as you work the color together, you may realize that it's leaning towards one specific color or leaning towards warm or cool. Your goal in making a chromatic black is neutralizing all color in order to create a very deep dark tone. Because my chromatic black is looking more brown than black, I chose to grab some more blue in order to neutralize the warmth in the brown. Whenever you're trying to make a neutral tone, like gray, black, or brown, it's important that you're mixing in the complementary tone in order to neutralize the saturation of what's already there. If my mixture was too green, I might mix in some more red. If my mixture is a little bit too red or a little bit too warm, I would then go in with some blue. There will be some occasions when you want your black tone to lean towards a specific color. You can create endless versions of chromatic black depending on the specific combinations of different primary colors you use and the ratios in which you use them. This can be really important for capturing the color of light and the color of shadows that you might see or imagine in your subject you're painting. Once you've mixed your chromatic black, you should be ready to make your value scale. Keep in mind that acrylic paint dries pretty fast, so you're going to want to be speedy. You can also cover your palette with a Tupperware and mist it with some water, which will help with the drying time. To create my value scale, I've taped off a long rectangular section to get some clean edges. To make a 9 value scale, I separate my rectangle into thirds. I then separate each third into 3 more sections, and then label it from 1 to 9. The next thing I'll do is I'll take some titanium white and squeeze it out onto a section of my palette. You can make a value scale in thousands of different ways, but I'm going to show you this specific technique or the specific step-by-step process in case it's helpful. So the first thing that I will paint is the pure white on square number 1. I'll then wash off my brush and I'll paint the pure chromatic black on square number 9. I realize that these aren't squares, they're rectangles, but that's just fine. After I paint in each rectangle, I dip my brush in water when it still has some paint on it, and make a little swatch right next to my value scale so I can get a sense of what that color will look like when it's transparent. We are really going to hone in on how transparency and opacity can create really interesting different effects in painting when used side by side. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take equal parts of my white and my black and mix them together in the center with my palette knife. I'm going to do my best to make it as middle of a tone as possible and then paint it into the middle rectangle or rectangle number 5. Next, I take my midtone and I separate it into 2 different piles. One of these piles will get darker and one of the piles will get lighter. Next, I'm going to mix my shades. So the word shade is used whenever you make a color darker with black. So I've taken a scoop of black, a pretty small scoop, and I'm going to subtly shift my tone. I'm going to tweak my recipe until it's slightly but noticeably darker than my midtone. At this point, I should have painted it in to square number 6, but I messed up, so don't make my same mistake. But you can also sort of see how I fix my problem in a few minutes. So when you mix your shades, or your darker tones, you should put them on the side of the spectrum that leans towards black. I add another scoop of black to darken it even more. At this point, I realize the mistake I've made, and to fix the problem, I paint over the white square with black and the black square with white in order to get a successful range of values, which should end up looking like a gradient. I still need to go in and fix the numbers that I've labeled them, as your lightest should be 1 and your darkest should be 9. You may be curious why we would need to mix a chromatic black when we could just buy a black paint from the store. And my answer to that question is that when we see dark tones in real life, we see beautiful shadows that are filled with color, filled with chroma and hue and beautiful but subtle and really specific color. So mixing a chromatic black can allow you to have so much more control over the overall sense of color in your work. It also helps to capture light in a way that's more realistic, even if you're painting abstract. Moving on to the lighter end of the spectrum, I add a small scoop of white to my reserved midtone and continue my process. Removing the tape will reveal a really clean edge that'll be really satisfying. This is a technique that I recommend using whenever you're working on watercolor paper with acrylics. When you're finished with your value scale, another step in your sketchbook assignment is to play with your values. You can do this however you would like. Here I demonstrate painting a plant from life using a monochromatic color palette. I first treat my paper with a very light gray wash and let it dry. You can make a wash by adding a bit of water to your acrylics, and it can be however thick or thin you would like. But this will create a very subtle treatment to the paper before I begin. In this painting, I work from back to front and begin with an underpainting to build upon. I start by looking at the shadows cast on the paper and capture them with a subtle shade of gray. In order to capture these shadows from observation, it's important to think about the most general shapes that you see and translate them over with your brush. I'm constantly glancing back to try to capture the exact nuance of those shapes of shadow. So I'm really thinking about the most general things that I see. I'm trying to edit down those shapes to their most important qualities. Next, I go through with a thin, flat brush to paint in the major contour lines, starting with the stems. I try to mimic the specific curve I see in the plants. The next thing I'll do is slowly move closer to the viewer in what I'm painting and what I'm seeing, and paint in the leaf shapes with a middle gray. I'm now working from dark to light because shadows often live beneath something else. I physically layer my tones, like how they sit in space. The very last things I'll add are crisp white highlights that sit on the outer surfaces. Notice how often I get more paint on my brush and wash my brush off in order to keep a clean and controlled palette. Next, I add some drama with some pure black and white to create some crisp moments of light as I further describe form. Typically, when things have really high contrast, they come forward and feel foregrounded. Despite the fact that this is a pretty close-up subject, the haziness of the shadows, in contrast to the really sharp and high contrast details, really helps to articulate depth in the scene. I also encourage you to doodle with paint. What kind of space or form will you create when you're mindlessly laying down brushstrokes? When I draw and paint, I often work intuitively for a bit, and then imagine a light source and create shadows in response to that imagined light source. I'm then going through and layering some shadows, I'm inventing space, and I'm allowing this imagined light source to guide me through the process. We visually understand form in the world around us because of light, so it's always an important thing to keep in mind. I'm also going through and just playing with paint application. What happens when you scrape your palette knife loaded up with paint across your paper? What happens when you layer transparent and opaque paint in different ways? One benefit of acrylic paint is its capacity for quick experimentation. Never be afraid to try something new, embrace your mistakes, and invent your own processes. I can't wait to see what you make, and I hope you have a great day.